Alright, hey guys, today I'll be explaining COMM 305 Chapter 5 Activity-Based Costing. I'll be going through the definitions, the formulas, and examples to properly explain everything in this chapter. All information in this video is through the COMM 305 textbook and problems, and only the important information that you need to know for your midterm and final was added. You guys can follow along with the video by downloading the file and accessing all this information in the description below. So how does this work? Well, you can see here it's kind of like a mind map where you can click on any cell that you want and it takes you to that information. So if we want to learn about the steps in traditional based costing, I could just click on this one and I can just go through the steps like that. And it's very easy. If I want to go back, I click on the map on the top right. If I want to look at all the formulas for this chapter, I can click it and it brings me to all the formulas needed. All right, so let's get started with traditional based costing. So what is traditional based costing? Well, it's a method to assign overhead based on a single overhead rate to products or job orders. It is a more straightforward costing method compared to activity-based costing, where in activity-based costing, we're using many overhead rates. So overhead rate is based on a single cost driver. This is for a traditional based costing, such as direct labor hours, machine hours, or units produced. Usually, let's say for a midterm, it might say under traditional based costing, we're going to be using direct labor for our overhead rate or machine hours for our overhead rate. So here's a step-by-step guide on how to actually conduct a traditional based costing. So step one is to determine your cost driver. Determine a cost driver that has a strong correlation to overhead costs. So like we said before, the question might tell you that direct labor hours is your cost driver or the reason why or reason how to calculate overhead costs. Step two is to calculate your predetermined overhead rate. So here's the formula of predetermined overhead rate is equal to your total estimated overhead cost divided by the total estimated amount of cost driver. So this is pretty easy. Usually they'll give you your estimated overhead cost, and all you have to do is just find the amount for the cost driver. So like we said before, if it's direct labor, we just try to find the amount of direct labor used for this activity, and then we just divide that by estimated overhead cost. And in step three, we want to apply or find the applied overhead rate. So the applied overhead rate is equal to your predetermined overhead rate times the actual amount of cost driver. The actual amount of the cost driver, it's the actual amount of activity that took place. So like in predetermined over here, it's an estimated amount. So we may have estimated, and then at the end, we can find our actual by applying. So we find the actual by applying the overhead rate. So now let's look at the most important part of this chapter, and it's activity-based costing. And so here's a basic understanding on how it works and the components of it. So what is activity-based costing or ABC costing? Activity-based costing is a method for assigning cost to products or services. It bases cost on the activities calculated from their consumption of resources. So in this chapter, we're using activities. So activity is any event, task, or unit of work with a specific goal. So example of an activity could be setting up machinery, designing products, distributing finished goods, operating machines. So these activities consume resources. Activity cost pool, these are costs are accumulated for specific activities. ABC does not use a single cost pool for overhead costs, though uses multiple cost pools to accumulate costs of similar activities. And this may sound confusing, but when we go through an example throughout this video, you'll see what a cost pool is and how we can assign it and use it to actually calculate our activity-based costing. So a cost driver, this causes the cost of an activity to increase or decrease. And so why do we use activity-based costing? What is its purpose? Well, it's for accurate costing. ABC provides a more precise cost allocation by assigning costs based on actual activities. All right, so here are the steps in activity-based costing. So step one, we want to identify activities, B, cost drivers, and then C, allocate overhead to cost pools. So to identify activities, we want to identify all activities that are necessary to produce a product or service. We want to understand how each activity contributes to the overall cost and identify resources consumed. So this is why we split up these activities. B, we have identify cost drivers. We want to identify the cost driver that corresponds to each cost pool and each activity. And then C, we want to allocate overhead. So we want to spread the overhead costs based on how much they have to do with each activity. So here's an example of what this would look like. So you can see here, if I get my pen out, we have, I'll get the pen so I could draw, activity cost pool. So this is step A. And so the activities that we have are ordering and receiving, machine setup, machining, assembly, and inspection. Then we have B, it's our identify cost drivers. And so for ordering and receiving, our cost driver would be orders. For machine setup, our cost driver would be setups. For machining, it would be machine hours. For assembly, it would be parts. And for inspection, we can put our cost driver would be inspection. Sometimes, depending on the exam or the question that you're doing, you might have to find this cost driver. So this wouldn't be given to you. All it would be given is orders, setups, machine hours, parts, and inspection. And you would have to find which cost driver is associated with each activity. So just make sure you guys know how to actually link it to the activity and which one corresponds to certain activities. And then you can see here with C, we have our estimated overhead for each activity. So for ordering and receiving, we're estimating to use 140,000. For machine setup, we're estimating 90,000. And for every other thing, it's our estimated. So what we think we're gonna use. All right, for step 2, calculate overhead rates. So activity-based overhead rate, this is the formula. It's equal to estimated overhead per activity divided by the estimated use of cost drivers per activity. So estimated overheads per activity is the estimated cost used in specific activities. B, the estimated use of cost drivers per activity. It's the total estimated use of cost drivers for every activity. So let's look at the second example on how to calculate overhead rates. All right, guys, so I'm going to show you how to calculate your activity-based overhead rate for the 5 cost pools. So let's do our step 1. We're going to write our knowns. And what our knowns is we have the formula for activity-based overhead rate. This is equal to your estimated overhead per activity divided by the estimated use of cost drivers per activity. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy paste this thing given here right underneath so I can add on to it. So you can see visually, so this is what we're given, and whatever I'm going to do right here is what we're going to be adding on to it. So I'm going to go find our, so we already have the estimated. Let me just rewrite that. Estimated. So our estimated overhead per activity is right here. So anything in orange. So that's the first part of our formula. And now I want to find our estimated use of cost drivers. Let me rewrite that again. Use of cost drivers per activity. So what we have here for product A and B is our estimated use of cost drivers per product, but we want to find per activity. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to find or create another column for the total, and I'm going to use the sum function. So I'm going to write sum, press tab to autocorrect the sum. I'm going to click product A, hold shift, and then click product B, click enter. Now you have your 700. And if you want to put this sum function for every single column or row, you just go into the corner until your cursor turns into a cross and you just drag down. So you click drag down and your sum function is added on to everything. And it also moves down. So you can see your D18 and E18 move down. So this one, it moves down as well. And so everything moves and now it works perfectly. Instead of retyping everything, you guys can save yourself a lot of time during the midterm. So now we find our estimated use of cost driver. So I can write that instead. So total estimated use of cost driver per activity. So zoom out so you see everything. And I'll put that. And so now we could find, I'll also put this in orange so you guys can visually see it. And now we can find our overhead rate. And so our overhead rate is now our estimated overhead per activity divided by our total estimated use of cost driver per activity. So it's 200, and this is going to be into dollars. And what you guys can do again is go into the corner and you just drag it down. And so you could see 480 divided by 1,200. And so this is, you guys can also do, so this is our overhead rate now. I'll put this in green. And what I like to do is to type it. So we have our $200 per order. So what I'm doing is just rewriting our cost driver. So it's 200 per order, 300 per setup, $50 per machine hour, $2 per part, and $400 per inspection. So that is how to find your activity-based overhead rate. All right, so step 3, assign overhead to products. So to assign overhead cost to products, we want to assign overhead rate to products using information from the previous steps, so 1 and 2. So our total overhead assigned to product, this is the sum of our overhead rate times the amount of activity used. And then if we want to find our per unit overhead cost, this is equal to our total overhead assigned to product divided by our total units. So here's the example on how to assign and calculate total overhead assigned to products. All right, guys, so now I'm going to see how to find our per unit overhead cost. So let's see what our overhead per unit cost for product A is, assuming we sell 1,000,000 products. So step 1, let's write our knowns. Our formula for this is our per unit overhead cost is equal to total overhead assigned to product divided by total units. All right, so what we could see here is our total overhead assigned to product. We calculated this, so it's going to be 1,960,000, and then our total units is going to be 1,000,000. And so our per unit overhead cost is going to be 1.96 divided by 1,000,000, and it's $1.96 per unit. I'll put that in green. Now we're going to do the exact same thing, but to find the per unit overhead cost for product B. And now we're going to be assuming we sell 500,000. So like the same thing, step 1, let's write our knowns. And so since we're using the same formula, I'll just copy paste it. And we'll be using the exact same heading. So assign the product and our total units. So our total overhead assigned to product is what we calculated in step B. And that's 2,050,000. And our total units is 500,000. So our per unit overhead cost is equal to our total overhead assigned to product divided by, so you can put a slash for divide, our total units, which is 500,000. And it's $4.10 per unit overhead cost. I'll put that in green as well. All right, these are the formulas for the chapter. If you guys have any questions, just leave a comment and I'll try to respond to it. All right, thank you.